In early March 1962, the mid-Atlantic coast lay dormant under gray winter skies. Beach towns from Long Island to the Outer Banks sat nearly empty, their populations reduced to year-round residents and maintenance crews preparing for the coming season. Boardwalks stretched along silent shorelines, their planks weathered by salt and winter storms. The surf rolled in with rhythmic consistency, cold and gray-green, breaking against beaches still bearing the compressed sand of winter tides. The infrastructure of the coast had grown incrementally over decades. Barrier Islands hosted modest residential development connected to the mainland by causeways and wooden bridges. Oceanfront roads ran parallel to the shore, often within a few hundred feet of high tide. Houses stood on low pilings or concrete slabs, their foundations designed for the occasional hurricane, but built during an era when coastal building codes remained minimal. Wooden piers extended into the Atlantic, serving fishing boats and summer tourists. Dunes provided the primary defense against storm surge, their height and stability varying considerably along the coast. The engineered elements of this landscape existed in delicate equilibrium with natural processes. Jetties and groins interrupted longshore currents, creating localized erosion and accretion patterns. Drainage systems channeled stormwater through barrier islands toward the ocean. Electrical lines followed coastal roads on wooden poles. The system functioned adequately during normal conditions, but its margins were narrow. In the first days of March, nothing suggested those margins were about to be tested. The coast simply waited, cold and routine, as the ocean moved through its cycles. The meteorological conditions that produced the Ash Wednesday storm assembled gradually over several days. A low-pressure system developed off the coast of North Carolina on March 5, drawing moisture from the Atlantic, while a blocking high-pressure system positioned itself over the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. This configuration prevented the storm from following the typical nor'easter track that would have moved it quickly northeastward and out to sea. Instead, the low became stationary, locked in place by the atmospheric blocking pattern. The storm's position, approximately 200 miles east of the Virginia coast, placed the mid-Atlantic shoreline in a zone of persistent onshore winds. As the low slowly drifted northward over 3 days, these winds maintained a nearly constant northeast to east direction, driving water continuously toward the coast. The wind field was broad but not exceptionally intense by hurricane standards. Sustained winds reached 40 to 50 miles per hour along most of the affected coastline, with gusts occasionally exceeding 70 miles per hour at exposed locations. The critical factor was duration combined with astronomical timing. The storm's arrival coincided with spring tides, when the gravitational alignment of the sun and moon produces higher than normal tidal ranges. Over the course of March 6, 7, and 8, the storm persisted through at least 5 complete tidal cycles. Each high tide drove water farther inland than the previous cycle as waves and surge progressively eroded protective dunes and overwhelmed low-lying areas. The infrastructure along the coast had been designed for storms that passed in hours, not days. Buildings could withstand temporary flooding, but not water that returned every 12 hours with increasing force. Roads built at elevations that normally remained dry during storms found themselves submerged repeatedly. The mechanical persistence of wind and water, rather than any single extreme measurement, became the destructive mechanism. The storm's moisture content varied with latitude. Along the North Carolina coast, heavy rain mixed with wind-driven spray, reducing visibility and saturating barrier islands already compromised by overwash. Moving northward into Virginia and Maryland, precipitation transitioned to a mixture of rain and wet snow. In Delaware, New Jersey, and Long Island, heavy snow accumulated as cold air fed into the western side of the circulation. Total snowfall exceeded 20 inches in portions of New Jersey and approached 30 inches in isolated areas of Long Island, though these measurements represent 3-day accumulations rather than single-event totals. Near the immediate coastline, the distinction between precipitation types became irrelevant. Wind speeds of 40 to 60 miles per hour drove horizontal sheets of sleet and spray across barrier islands and beachfront communities. Visibility dropped to near zero during peak wind periods. The persistent northeast wind created a setup effect, pushing water against the coast faster than it could drain away through inlets and tidal channels. Tide gauges documented water levels 4 to 8 feet above normal high tide at various locations along the coast, with the excess persisting for hours rather than the brief peak typical of passing storms. Erosion began during the first high tide cycle on March 6. Waves attacked dunes continuously, undercutting their seaward faces and causing periodic slumping. Sand suspended in the turbulent water turned the surf zone opaque. Where dunes had been artificially lowered or removed for access roads and building sites, overwashed channels formed quickly, allowing seawater to flow across barrier islands toward bay waters on their landward sides. The beach profile steepened as waves removed sand from the upper beach and deposited it in deeper water offshore. By the evening of March 6, oceanfront roads in multiple communities stood under several feet of water, and dune lines that had existed for decades showed visible degradation. The storm was 12 hours old and showed no indication of movement. The second high tide arrived during the pre-dawn hours of March 7. Water levels exceeded those of the previous cycle by 1 to 2 feet as storm surge compounded with astronomical high tide. Waves now encountered dunes already compromised by 12 hours of erosion. Breaches widened. Overwash intensified. At multiple locations from New Jersey to North Carolina, the protective dune systems that had confined storm surge to the beach zone ceased to function. Water moved freely across barrier islands, flowing westward toward Back Bay areas and transforming one-dimensional coastal flooding into omnidirectional inundation. Highway infrastructure failed in sequence. Route 12 along the Outer Banks, the primary north-south artery for coastal North Carolina, suffered multiple breaches as ocean water cut new inlets through Hatteras Island. State Route 35 in New Jersey, running along the narrow barrier beach between Seaside Heights and Island Beach State Park, disappeared beneath 3 to 5 feet of moving water for miles. The Ocean City Longport Bridge connecting southern New Jersey barrier islands to the mainland sustained damage from debris and wave impact. Causeways linking Chincoteague Island to the Virginia mainland became impassable. The mechanical process was repetitive. Waves undermined pavement edges. Sand and gravel washed from road beds. Unsupported sections of asphalt broke into large fragments and shifted. Wooden bridges sustained damage to pilings and decking as floating debris impacted their structures. Buildings near the immediate shoreline experienced foundation failure as sand eroded from beneath them. Structures did not collapse dramatically in most cases, but rather settled, tilted, or partially separated from their supports. Oceanfront motels, restaurants, and private homes stood at awkward angles or shifted seaward by several feet. The barrier islands were being mechanically disassembled, their infrastructure reduced to components in motion. By midday March 7, coastal communities from Long Island to Cape Hatteras found themselves isolated. The breaching of access roads and causeways severed land connections to the mainland. Ferry services suspended operations as winds and seas exceeded safe operating limits. Telephone lines failed as wooden poles toppled or snapped under wind load and accumulating wet snow. Electrical distribution systems collapsed in stages as substations flooded and transmission lines came down. The disruption of utility infrastructure produced cascading effects. Electric pumps that normally maintained drainage in low-lying areas ceased operation, allowing floodwater to accumulate in streets and buildings. Water treatment facilities lost power, contaminating municipal water supplies with seawater intrusion. Emergency generators at hospitals and shelters operated as designed, but fuel supplies for extended operation became a concern as the storm showed no sign of departure. Communication with isolated communities relied on limited radio equipment and Coast Guard aircraft, when weather permitted flight operations. The sensory environment during the second night of the storm reflected complete infrastructure failure. Coastal areas lay dark, their streetlights and building illumination extinguished. Wind maintained its persistent northeast direction, a constant mechanical presence rather than the variable gusts typical of faster-moving storms. Structures stood in water that moved with tidal rhythm but no longer fully receded. The normal sounds of a functioning coast, the hum of electrical systems and mechanical equipment and vehicle traffic, had ceased. Only wind and water remained audible, along with occasional structural failures as weakened buildings shed portions of their exteriors or collapsed partially into the flood. The storm persisted. The third high tide arrived. Infrastructure that had survived 2 cycles now faced a third assault in conditions of accumulated damage and no opportunity for drainage or repair. The Ash Wednesday storm maintained its position off the coast through March 8, subjecting the shoreline to a third full day of northeast winds and elevated water levels. This duration distinguished the event from typical nor'easters, which generally transit the coast in 12 to 36 hours. The extended period of wave attack and storm surge produced erosion totals that exceeded the combined impact of multiple normal storms. Beaches lost decades of accumulated sand in 72 hours. Dune systems that provided protection for coastal development simply ceased to exist at many locations. At Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, the oceanfront boardwalk, constructed of heavy timber and concrete supports, broke apart in sections and scattered across the beach and adjacent streets. In Ocean City, Maryland, the fishing pier, a substantial structure extending 1,000 feet into the Atlantic, sustained complete destruction of its outer sections. Along New Jersey's barrier islands, entire blocks of oceanfront development experienced catastrophic damage. Buildings deemed structurally compromised by the end of the storm numbered in the thousands. Many would face condemnation and demolition. The storm's destructive capacity derived from repetition rather than intensity. Each tidal cycle attacked a coastline incrementally weaker than 12 hours earlier. Dunes lowered by 2 feet during the first tide lost another 2 feet during the second, then failed entirely during the third. Buildings flooded once could be pumped out and dried. Buildings flooded 5 times experienced structural degradation that could not be reversed. Roads damaged during one surge suffered additional undermining during the next until they became impassable. The mechanical advantage belonged entirely to the ocean, which applied force continuously, while defensive structures and infrastructure weakened with no opportunity for repair or reinforcement. Wind measurements, while significant, remained below hurricane thresholds. Wave heights, while impressive, did not represent record conditions. Water levels, though elevated well above normal, did not exceed those recorded during major hurricanes. Yet the combination of all factors sustained over 3 days produced a coastal disaster that exceeded many more intense but shorter storms in total impact. On March 9, the blocking high-pressure system that had held the storm in place finally weakened. The low-pressure center began moving northeastward, following the track typical of departing nor'easters. Wind speeds decreased. The surf gradually subsided. By midday, precipitation had ended along most of the affected coast. Tides returned to near-normal levels. The mechanical assault that had persisted for 72 hours simply ceased. What emerged in calm conditions was a coastline structurally altered. Beaches had retreated landward by 50 to 100 feet at many locations, their sand transported offshore into deeper water where it would remain for years or permanently. New inlets had opened through barrier islands where none had existed, most notably along the Outer Banks where multiple breaches cut through Highway 12. The pre-storm configuration of dunes, roads, and development no longer existed in recognizable form across long stretches of shoreline. Economic losses totaled approximately $300 million in 1962 currency, equivalent to several billion in contemporary terms. More than 45,000 structures sustained damage, with several thousand destroyed beyond repair. Thousands of residents faced displacement from condemned properties. The fishing and tourism industries that supported coastal economies experienced immediate and severe disruption. Some communities required months to restore basic services and years to rebuild infrastructure. The long-term policy consequences proved significant. The storm demonstrated that Barrier Island development faced risks that existing building codes and zoning regulations did not adequately address. Subsequent decades brought federal flood insurance programs, stricter coastal construction standards, and recognition of dunes as critical infrastructure deserving protection and management. The Ash Wednesday storm became a reference point in coastal engineering, a case study in duration-driven disaster. The ocean continued its routine motion, waves arriving in rhythmic sequence as they always had. The coast, however, had been reset to a configuration it had not held in living memory. Infrastructure, where it remained, now occupied a shoreline that bore little resemblance to the one that had existed the previous week.